On true crime threads, we reveal shocking secrets. A wife uncovers her husband's deadly past. Hazel thought she had found her soulmate in Easton. They met at a local charity event, where his charming demeanor and attentive nature instantly drew her in. Easton, a successful architect in his mid-30s, seemed like the ideal partner. He was kind, thoughtful, and had a mysterious air about him that Hazel found intriguing. His sharp sense of humor and confident posture made him stand out in a crowd, and it didn't take long for Hazel to feel an undeniable connection. Their relationship progressed quickly but naturally. Hazel often marveled at how well Easton seemed to understand her. He always knew the perfect way to cheer her up after a stressful day at work, and never hesitated to make time for her, no matter how busy his schedule was. She couldn't help but admire his ambition and drive. His work in designing high-end residential properties was not only lucrative but also reflected his artistic talent. As they spent more time together, Easton became a regular topic of conversation with Hazel's friends and family. They all agreed that he was a catch. Her mother, in particular, was thrilled for Hazel, frequently commenting on how lucky she was to have found someone so polished and attentive. Even Hazel's closest friends, who were typically skeptical of whirlwind romances, were impressed by Easton's charm and the way he treated her. Within months, they were inseparable. Easton was always surprising her with little romantic gestures, whether it was showing up with her favorite flowers or planning impromptu weekend getaways to quaint bed and breakfasts. He seemed like the perfect man, thoughtful, caring, and deeply invested in their future together. After a whirlwind romance, they were married within a year. Their wedding was a small but elegant affair, held at a picturesque vineyard just outside the city. Easton insisted on handling most of the planning, ensuring everything was flawless. The way he looked at her as she walked down the aisle made her feel like the luckiest woman alive. Despite their happiness, Hazel couldn't ignore that Easton rarely talked about his past. She knew he had been married before, and that his ex-wife, Sandra, had left him after what he described as a messy divorce. He would occasionally mention how the experience had shaped him, making him appreciate the importance of a strong and supportive partnership, but he never went into detail. Hazel assumed the topic was painful for him and didn't want to push. After the wedding, they moved into a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a stunning property with a manicured lawn, a spacious backyard, and an open-concept layout that Hazel adored. Easton had designed it himself, a fact he took great pride in. Hazel felt like she was living in a dream, but as time went on, subtle cracks began to appear in the perfection of their life together. Hazel started noticing odd behaviors. Easton had always been meticulous, but his protectiveness over certain areas of the house felt excessive. The basement, in particular, was always locked, and Easton dismissed her questions about it with vague excuses about storage and clutter. He often reminded her not to worry about it, claiming it was just filled with tools and old supplies he hadn't gotten around to organizing. Hazel didn't push the issue, but the secrecy nagged at her. There were other small things. Occasionally, she would catch Easton staring off into space, his expression unreadable. When she asked what was on his mind, he would brush it off, saying he was just tired from work. His usual warmth would sometimes give way to moments of cold silence, though he always snapped out of it quickly, as if realizing the shift. Hazel told herself that every relationship had its quirks, and these minor concerns weren't enough to overshadow the love they shared. She convinced herself that she was overthinking. After all, no one was perfect, and Easton had been nothing but devoted to her. But deep down, a quiet unease began to take root, a feeling Hazel couldn't fully explain. It was as though her intuition was trying to tell her something, but she wasn't ready to listen. For now, she chose to focus on the good and ignore the gnawing doubts that occasionally crept into her thoughts. Their life together seemed picture perfect. Hazel had no idea that the man she loved was hiding a secret so dark it would shatter everything she thought she knew about him. Hazel's suspicions began with a subtle unease, the kind of quiet discomfort that was easy to dismiss at first. But as time went on, the feeling became harder to ignore. It started when she received an anonymous message on social media, a message that sent a chill down her spine. "You don't know who you're married to." At first, she thought it was some kind of joke, perhaps a prank from someone who had too much time on their hands. Hazel deleted the message without replying, convincing herself it was nothing to worry about. But the words lingered in her mind, replaying themselves whenever she was alone or when Easton was away at work. What did the sender mean by that? She tried to dismiss her paranoia, telling herself it was just a random troll trying to cause trouble. But then, another message appeared a week later, this time containing a link. Curiosity got the better of her, and she clicked it. The link led to an old news article about the mysterious disappearance of Easton's ex-wife, Sandra. Hazel read the article carefully, her heart pounding harder with each sentence. Sandra had vanished 2 years earlier, shortly after her divorce from Easton. The article mentioned that Sandra was last seen leaving her workplace one evening but never made it home. Her car was found abandoned a few miles away, and no evidence of foul play was discovered. Despite extensive searches, no leads ever emerged, and Sandra's case went cold. The details were sparse, but Hazel couldn't help feeling a creeping sense of dread. Easton had never mentioned that Sandra had disappeared. He had only ever referred to her leaving after their divorce. Why would he omit something so significant? The thought that he might have been hiding such a crucial detail filled Hazel with unease. She debated confronting Easton about the article but hesitated. What would she even say? And how would he react? Easton was normally composed and even-tempered, but she couldn't shake the memory of how defensive he became when she asked questions about the locked basement. She didn't want to provoke him without knowing more. As the days passed, Hazel found herself unable to think about anything else. She searched Easton's name online and discovered obscure forums where people speculated about Sandra's disappearance. Some theories were wild and far-fetched, but one in particular caught her attention, a post suggesting that Easton had killed Sandra to cover up some kind of dark secret. The user claimed to have lived near Easton and Sandra during their marriage and described Easton as controlling and quick-tempered. Hazel's stomach churned as she read the post. It felt surreal, like she was reading about someone else entirely. The Easton she knew was nothing like the man described in those forums. He was thoughtful, patient, and loving, or was he? She started questioning everything she thought she knew about him. Her growing unease turned into paranoia. She began paying closer attention to Easton's behavior, looking for any small signs that might confirm or refute her suspicions. She noticed how he seemed unusually attentive, almost as if he could sense her anxiety. Was he genuinely concerned for her, or was he trying to keep her distracted from the truth? One night, Hazel mustered the courage to ask him about Sandra. She mentioned the article she'd come across and asked why he hadn't told her about the disappearance. Easton's reaction was swift and unsettling. His usual calm demeanor disappeared, replaced by anger and irritation. He accused Hazel of invading his privacy and of digging into matters that didn't concern her. His response shook her. He had never spoken to her that way before. The anger in his voice felt disproportionate to the situation, almost like he was trying to shut the conversation down before it could continue. Hazel backed off, apologizing for bringing it up, but inside, her suspicions only grew stronger. As she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, she couldn't stop replaying the confrontation in her mind. Why would he react so strongly if he had nothing to hide? She tried to tell herself that he was just sensitive about the topic, that it was a painful chapter in his life, and that she was overreacting. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Hazel began to doubt everything she thought she knew about her husband. What if the anonymous messages were right? What if Easton wasn't the man she believed him to be? And what if Sandra's disappearance wasn't a mystery at all, but a secret buried closer to home than Hazel ever imagined? Hazel's curiosity about the locked basement grew into an obsession she couldn't shake. The door had been there all along, a seemingly innocuous part of their home, but now it loomed in her mind like a forbidden boundary. She had always trusted Easton's explanation that it was just a storage area filled with clutter he hadn't had time to organize. But the secrecy surrounding it now felt deliberate, as though it was meant to keep her out. She began to notice how Easton always kept the key on him, tucked away in his pocket or placed on the nightstand where it was never out of reach. He rarely went into the basement himself, which only added to the mystery. Why keep something locked away if it was just storage? The question haunted her, building a pressure in her mind that refused to ease. One evening, while Easton was in the shower, Hazel finally decided to act. Her heart pounded as she searched his jacket, hanging neatly on the back of the bedroom door. She found the key in one of the inner pockets, its metallic surface cool against her shaking fingers. For a moment she hesitated. She felt as though she were crossing a line, invading his privacy in a way that could never be undone. But the nagging doubt in her mind urged her forward, whispering that she needed to know the truth. The hallway felt longer than usual as she made her way to the basement door. The house was eerily quiet, and every sound, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the faint hum of the refrigerator, seemed amplified in the stillness. She reached the door and inserted the key, her breath hitching as the lock clicked open. The air inside the basement was cool and slightly damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew. Hazel flipped the light switch, illuminating a space that seemed ordinary at first glance. Shelves lined the walls holding old paint cans, tools, and boxes labeled with Easton's precise handwriting. It looked like the storage room he had always claimed it to be, but something felt off. As she stepped further inside, her eyes were drawn to a section of the floor in the corner. The concrete there was smoother and lighter in color, standing out against the rest of the surface. It looked like it had been poured recently, or at least more recently than the rest of the basement. The sight made her stomach churn. Hazel knelt down, running her fingers across the smooth surface. It was cold and unyielding, giving no hint of what might lie beneath. The realization hit her like a weight. This wasn't just a random patch of concrete. It had been placed there deliberately, covering something up. A wave of nausea rolled over her as she stood up, backing away from the spot. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. What could Easton have buried there? She tried to calm herself, reminding herself that she didn't know anything for sure. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just an old repair he'd done years ago. But the thought felt hollow, a flimsy excuse to deny the fear that had taken hold of her. She quickly locked the basement door and returned the key to Easton's jacket. By the time he came out of the shower, she was sitting on the couch, trying to look as though nothing had happened. Her heart was still racing, and her hands trembled slightly, but she managed to force a smile when he walked into the room. That night, Hazel barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the concrete patch in the basement, its smooth surface like a taunt, daring her to uncover the truth. She knew she couldn't ignore it, but she didn't know what to do. Should she confront Easton? Call the police? The thought of accusing her husband of something so horrific seemed impossible, yet the doubt in her mind refused to fade. As the hours dragged on, Hazel realized that whatever was hidden in the basement, it wasn't just going to go away. She had crossed a line by unlocking that door, and now there was no turning back. Unable to shake the growing fear that something was terribly wrong, Hazel decided she couldn't handle this alone. The weight of her suspicions, combined with the terrifying implications of the basement's concrete patch, was too much to bear. She knew she needed someone who could investigate without tipping off Easton, so she reached out to a private investigator she found online. The decision wasn't easy. It felt like a betrayal of the man she had loved and trusted. But the gnawing sense of dread left her with little choice. The investigator, a man named Peter with years of experience in uncovering hidden truths, listened patiently as Hazel explained her concerns. She told him about the anonymous messages, the news article about Sandra's disappearance, and the unsettling discovery in the basement. She omitted no detail, even sharing her fears about Easton's sudden defensiveness when she had tried to discuss Sandra. Peter assured her that he would dig into Easton's past and see what he could find. Hazel felt a mix of relief and guilt after the call. For the first time, she was taking action, but it felt like she was stepping into dangerous territory. Every day, while Easton went to work, she waited anxiously for updates from Peter. She tried to go about her daily routine, but her mind was consumed with thoughts of what he might uncover. A week later, Peter called with his findings. He told Hazel that Easton's name had indeed come up during the initial investigation into Sandra's disappearance. At the time, he had been cooperative with the police and provided an alibi for the night Sandra went missing. Hazel felt a flicker of hope maybe Easton had been truthful after all. But Peter wasn't finished. He revealed something that made Hazel's blood run cold. Shortly after Sandra's disappearance, Easton had made an unusual purchase: several bags of quick-dry cement. The transaction had been recorded on a hardware store receipt dated just days after Sandra was last seen. While this on its own wasn't definitive proof of wrongdoing, it was suspicious when combined with the unexplained concrete patch in the basement. Peter also found records of Easton renting heavy-duty tools from a local equipment store around the same time. The evidence painted a chilling picture, but it was still circumstantial. Peter recommended that Hazel report her concerns to the police, especially the information about the basement. Hazel hesitated. She was terrified of what might happen if Easton found out she had gone to the authorities. But the thought of living with the possibility that she was married to a killer was even more unbearable. After another sleepless night, Hazel made the decision to call the police. She gave an anonymous tip, detailing her suspicions and pointing them toward the concrete patch in the basement. She knew the authorities would need more than her word to act, but she hoped the details she provided would be enough to warrant further investigation. The waiting was agonizing. Hazel couldn't bring herself to tell Peter or anyone else what she had done, fearing that speaking it aloud would make the situation even more real. She avoided Easton as much as possible, terrified that he would sense her unease. Every moment spent in his presence felt like walking on a knife's edge. One evening, while Easton was in the shower, Hazel heard a car pull into the driveway. She peeked out the window and saw two unmarked police cars. Her stomach churned with fear and anticipation. This was it. The secret she had uncovered was about to come to light, and she had no idea what it would mean for her or for the man she had once thought she knew so well. The sound of the police knocking on the door was sharp and authoritative, making Hazel jump. Her heart raced as she hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the hallway where Easton was still in the shower. She opened the door slowly, trying to mask her anxiety as two officers stood on the porch, their expressions serious but calm. "Is Easton home?" one of them asked, their tone leaving no room for evasion. Hazel nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. She gestured toward the bathroom and quietly informed them he was in the shower. They stepped inside, and the lead officer spoke firmly but softly. "Please stay here, ma'am. We'll handle this." What followed was a surreal blur of events. The officers approached the bathroom, knocked, and waited for Easton to answer. When he emerged, wrapped in a towel and visibly startled, they informed him they had a warrant to search the premises. Hazel stood frozen in the living room, her stomach twisting in knots as she watched Easton's expression shift from confusion to a calm, measured demeanor. He didn't argue, though Hazel could sense the tension radiating from him. As the officers moved to the basement, Easton glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's going on, Hazel?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. She couldn't bring herself to answer. Instead, she stared at the floor, her silence speaking louder than any words could. The officers spent hours in the basement, carefully breaking through the concrete patch that had haunted Hazel for weeks. She tried to stay out of the way, sitting stiffly on the couch as the noise of tools and muffled voices echoed through the house. Easton paced the room, his expression unreadable. Occasionally he glanced toward her, but she avoided his gaze, afraid of what she might see there. Finally, the lead officer emerged from the basement, his face grim. He quietly radioed for additional units, and moments later, Easton was placed under arrest. Hazel watched in stunned silence as they read him his rights, the words echoing in her ears like a distant hum. As Easton was led out of the house, he turned to her one last time. His expression was a mixture of anger and betrayal, but he said nothing. Hazel felt a pang of guilt, but it was overwhelmed by the weight of relief and dread. Whatever the officers had found in the basement, it had confirmed her worst fears. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage and police investigations. The news reported that human remains had been found beneath the concrete, later identified through forensic analysis as Sandra's. The discovery was damning, and additional evidence began to surface. Witnesses came forward with accounts of Easton's controlling behavior during his marriage to Sandra, and financial records showed he had withdrawn a large sum of money shortly after her disappearance, fueling suspicions of premeditation. Hazel struggled to process the reality of what had happened. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, had harbored a dark and terrible secret all along. She couldn't reconcile the kind, attentive husband she had known with the person who had committed such a heinous act. In the weeks leading up to Easton's trial, Hazel found herself reliving every moment of their relationship, searching for signs she had missed. She wondered how she could have been so blind, how she had ignored the subtle warnings that something was amiss. The guilt weighed heavily on her, even though she knew she wasn't responsible for Easton's actions. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Easton was convicted of Sandra's murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hazel watched from the gallery, her emotions a tangled mess of sorrow, anger, and relief. In the aftermath, Hazel tried to rebuild her life, but the scars of what she had uncovered lingered. She moved out of the house, unable to bear the memories it held, and sought therapy to help process the trauma. Though the experience had shattered her trust and sense of security, it also taught her the importance of listening to her instincts, even when the truth was terrifying. Hazel knew she would never fully escape the shadow of what had happened, but she was determined to move forward, one step at a time. She had uncovered the truth, no matter how painful, and in doing so, she had ensured that Sandra's story would not remain buried in silence.